Bird Lore, Volume 18, for March and April of 1916. The Interesting Barn Owl, by Joseph W. Lippincott. The barn owl commands my respect. He is the greatest mouse-eating machine I have yet encountered, and as such surely deserves every consideration in these days of crop destruction by rodents. Like most owls, he does not allow his presence long to remain unsuspected. A loud, harsh scream after nightfall, repeated at the right intervals to keep one awake, and echoed by the young owls when they appear, is his greeting. And well may the little mice shiver in their poor retreats. I heard the good old barn owls again and again during early spring nights, and later found that 2 or perhaps more young ones were generally in or about a hemlock grove not far from the creek and the swampy meadows that make such ideal feeding grounds and are, in fact, the nucleus of the rodent hosts that spread over the neighborhood farms each summer. It was by mere accident, however, that I found a nest. A neighbor was planning a greenhouse on the site then occupied by his young chickens and, to give security to the glass, cut down a great storm-battered and fire-scarred buttonball tree that stood at one end of his farm buildings. Down it came with terrific force, but without killing 3 young barn owls, which were able to give one of the workmen a big scare when he climbed over the top. And this happened in the middle of August, when one brood was already in the woods. They were in a deep, dark, ill-smelling hollow, and a weird-looking trio indeed, with the white down still clinging over the yellow-brown feathers. What startled the workmen was the splendid series of hisses, for they understood how to make the sound about as wickedly as the most poisonous serpent. A little owl is generally all grit, and these were the grittiest bramble-footed propositions I ever expect to handle. Their big eyes kept an unwinking glare fixed on each one who came near, and they leaped like lightning, often all 3 together, at a hand thrust within reach. It would have been very comical except for the bitter earnestness which these poor little fellows put into their defense, making one feel very sorry for them when double gloves prevailed, and they were deposited in a chicken coop nearby, to prevent interfering with the chopping. Then, for hours after the moving, it seemed as if steam were strangely and violently escaping from an ordinary chicken coop, much to the astonishment of visitors. Around the tree were many of the small masses of fur and bones which owls disgorge a few hours after meals. These show very well what animals have been taken and, in this case, were most interesting, since the dozens I examined contained the remains of field mice, deer mice, shrews, and moles only. No rabbits, no squirrels, no insects, no little birds. Indeed, there was not a feather of any kind, although the little chickens had been running around and roosting all spring and summer within a few feet, alluring easy and constantly announcing their presence by seductive peeping. The old hollow must have suffered long use. It opened toward the south end of a large limb hole about 30 feet from the ground, and also upward through the broken top of the tree. Though that exit was not used, and probably only served to let in a veritable deluge of water during the thunderstorms. No doubt, too, the young owls amused themselves watching the clouds and stars pass slowly over their heads day by day, with the added excitement of a hawk, buzzard, or small bird now and then. They rested on layers of debris which, when examined, showed that honeybees had once been tenants, and later bats and generations of owls, perhaps many other birds, for hollows have strange, interesting history. The birds themselves seemed about the size of old ones without the full feathering, strong muscle, and weight. They were so queer and wore such humorous expressions whenever approached that, from the first, they would have been objects of continual interested observation, were it not for the rather discouraging fact that this almost always brought on a quarrel. The bright light and exciting feelings seemed to confuse one so much that he would mistake the others for enemies and pounce on them. This caused equally fierce retaliation every time, and resulted in all 3 being scratched about the thighs. Darkening the coop remedied this. It impressed me then as strange. With all the birds' show of aggressiveness, there was no snapping of beaks nor marked disposition to bite. But I later found that they did not have the same strength in their beaks as most varieties of owls, particularly the great horned owls, which crushed the skull of a rabbit with such ease. This, I suppose, has something to do with the species' love of very small mammals, which can be torn to pieces and swallowed without trouble by those queer cavernous mouths. Their hooked claws, which gripped me on several occasions, were all right though, and as sharp as needles. The youngsters were left severely alone until evening, when, with the lessening light, came a quick change. They seemed to lose some of their fear, and to be expectantly listening for something. Every now and then, one would utter a rasping cry, which blended harmoniously with the insect chorus and yet could be heard a long distance. Just as the sun set, and the glow still spread over the west, the cries became very insistent, and a shadow seemed to pass for an instant over the coop, as one of the parents flew quietly into a locust tree nearby, and stood there close on the trunk, a mouse dangling from the left foot. It soon flew out and circled noiselessly, only to disappear very soon, much to the disgust of the coop occupants. Several minutes elapsed. By evening silence broke only by the rasping call and the drum of the katydids. Then an old owl circling by, bearing a mouse in its beak. It may have been the same bird and the same mouse, the deepening shadows making it impossible to see accurately. The night being dark, I left my hiding place and the birds until morning, when it was surprising to find only the smallest of the three in the coop, and that dead. The other two had escaped, but how they squeezed beneath slats which allowed only the tiniest chicks to go through will ever be a mystery to me. I could not even pull out the remaining one. It was much less developed than the other two, both in size of limb and feather, and had evidently succumbed to the effects of a frightful fall, though its body showed no bruise. I hunted around the debris of the felled tree, and finally spied the others, which had done some expert climbing and hidden in the darkest corners, one beneath a tree trunk, the other in a leafy top where it had evidently stayed all night, as evidenced by a kind of bed stamped down and lined with surplus food carried there by the parents. Such a supper, 3 particularly fine meadow mice and a fat star-nosed mole, all freshly killed and whole. The youngsters, which at first crouched silently, were in a very bitter frame of mind, so I carried them out by the wing-tips, the only satisfactory way I found of handling such a brambly article, and later made them stand in the light for a photograph, a difficult matter, because they ran with all speed for the woodpile as soon as released. Such as I thought I had them, after many attempts, one mistook the other for a foe, and, without preliminaries, went for him. However, the other one met the rush feet first and seized the attacking claws before they hit, practically holding down his brother by each foot while he glared into his face in comical fashion and hissed for all he was worth. This holding hands continued with much comical shaking of heads until both birds suddenly struck at each other somewhat as roosters do. Then they held hands again until separated and put into a deep open-top box for safekeeping. If left free, dogs, cats, and opossums would most likely have found them through the strong odor so noticeable about young birds of prey. The mice were, however, first cut into pieces and thrust down the apparently young birds' throats, while each was held by his feet and neck. Each night after that the youngsters were visited and fed by the devoted old ones, and always it was with mice of some kind or moles, principally meadow mice, house mice, white-footed mice, shrews, and ground moles, as many as 8 sometimes, as shown by the disgorged pellets or uneaten bodies. The parents also scrupulously cleaned the old box each night. They lived in the hemlock wood across the narrow valley, but in what tree I could not discover. One would appear soon after sunset with some kind of mouse, and by 11 o'clock had apparently satisfied the youngsters' hunger, for the rasping cries would usually cease, and an occasional louder and clearer cry of the old birds pierced the darkness. One fine morning found the youngsters gone. Day after day they had tried to jump out of the box, each time coming a little closer to the edge. After this they could be heard calling in the evenings and sometimes until dawn. Always in the wood they perched high up side by side or on nearby limbs, and lazily relied on their parents to keep up the good work of providing mice. On dark nights they called much longer than on moonlight nights, which convinced me that the hunting was more difficult then. Occasionally a parent could be seen standing always very erect on the barn gable overlooking a truck garden, but usually would watch from a tree in the marshy meadows, now and then dropping to the ground and staying there for considerable time as if hunting on foot among the grass clumps, a method which, From the great agility of the young when pursued on the ground and in the bush piles, I can well imagine no cat could improve one. I tried without success to draw them by imitating their strange cry, and also a mouse's squeak made by sucking loudly on the back of the hand. A screech owl and many wild owls would take instant notice of the latter, but not the barn owls. Even a rat caught in a trap failed to entice these birds, though several screech owls responded at once. But who has stirred a barn owl? Over the dew-laden meadows he stands guard, or perhaps at the edge of the moonlit cornfields, waiting for the only prey that seems to interest him. He knows the country like a book, the runways of the meadow mouse, the house mouse's path from corn shock to corn shock, the mole's early morning starting point. Under the old buttonball tree the broods of young chickens ran from early morning to night. The owner felt that the large owls were a menace to his flock, and watched for them with a gun. But with the fall of the old tree and the study of their food, a new light has spread to every farm in that vicinity. I heard the young owl's last rasp on October 16th. It was full of the weird power which thrills one in the dark hours. A few minutes later, a big bird flew low toward the orchard. The young owls had taken to hunting at last.